It's been nearly 2 decades since the Boston Globe published the first article in the series on sexual abuse, sexual violence in the Catholic Church. But the fallout is far from over, and too many have still not been held accountable for their crimes. Last week, Defrocked ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick became the highest-ranking church official to be criminally charged for sexual abuse, charged with 3 counts of indecent assault and battery on a 16-year-old boy in Wellesley in the 1970s. It's the only case against McCarrick that's still within the statute of limitations under state law. But there are many more credible accusations against McCarrick going back decades, claims that were shared with several leaders, including Pope John Paul II, but were ignored as McCarrick rose in church ranks. And as we know too well, he wasn't the only one. The Archdiocese of Boston settled 6 lawsuits last week against former church leaders accused of sexually assaulting boys across Massachusetts from 1966 to 1990. And in Canada, the bodies of hundreds of Indigenous children have been found at so-called residential schools, nearly 3/4 of which were run by Catholic congregations. So almost 2 decades after the Boston Phoenix and then the Globe first started to bring these crimes into the light, where are we? I'm joined by attorney Mitchell Garabedian, who's represented hundreds of victims of church abuse. Mitchell, as always, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You know, as I mentioned, you're representing the survivor in this McCarrick thing, and I know since the case is pending, you can't talk about details, but can you at least tell us why your client chose to come forward? It takes a lot of courage.
Well, he wanted to take the weight off his shoulders, the emotional weight many victims have, and they carry through their lives after being sexually abused as children. And he wanted to help other individuals, other sexual abuse victims, whether they be clergy sexual abuse victims or not. He wanted to help them, and he wanted to empower them. And lastly, he wanted to make the world a safer place for children through transparency, something the church will not do.
I want to get back to transparency in a second, but does the bringing charges against somebody at McCarrick's level, as I say, the highest level, does that trickle out into other potential prosecutions, or are the state statutes of limitations so inhibiting that this is a one-and-done kind of deal?
Well, it depends on the state. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine have a statute that allows for prosecution in certain circumstances when the molester or child abuser leaves the state. So it depends on the state. But, you know, this could be the beginning of a new era of going after the very powerful leaders within the Catholic Church. I mean, this is the first cardinal ever charged in the United States with sexually abusing a child. So this could be the very beginning.
You know, you mentioned lack of transparency, which is, it's sort of talk about Groundhog Day. There's never a time I see you that we don't talk about this. I was not aware till I read something where you were quoted the other day saying that when the church puts out these lists of accused child abusers in their ranks, they don't include the names of those priests, correct me if I'm wrong, please, in whose cases have been settled. Is that right? And what's the rationale for not including such names? Because I assume even they would not make an argument that they're doling out cash for innocent priests.
Well, what the church does from diocese to diocese and archdiocese to archdiocese is try to sanitize their lists. So they'll say, we'll have a list, but it doesn't include those who've been credibly accused who have passed away. We'll have a list, but it doesn't include those who have been credibly accused only one time. They continue with the exceptions so that the list is almost meaningless, and it re-victimizes clergy sexual abuse victims everywhere. It just fits the pattern and the attitude and the culture within the Catholic Church. Right now, we've got a situation where we've shown that a cardinal who has been charged with sexual assault of a minor, we've got a situation showing how deep and how wide and the scope, I should say, the scope of this is just enormous.
Well, I want to talk about the scope for a second. We know that the sainted, literally, John Paul II was aware of at least some of the accusations against McCarrick, and I should say more than accusations, the fact that he had committed crimes or at least violated church protocol, having sex with seminarians, etc. When he elevated him to bishop, I think it was in 2000, in D.C. I know you stay in touch with a ton of your clients. Is this make them feel better that there's no longer protection of at least former men at the top, or is it wildly dispiriting that it was authorized or allowed to proceed formally by men at the top?
It's both. It provides validation for many victims. But for instance, in the Vatican report, it's indicated that bishops saw Bishop McCarrick, sexually abusing another cleric, and they did nothing about it. So that is really unsettling to many, many victims. It provides validation, yet it's unsettling and it's disturbing.
You know, Mitchell, when you read things like a couple of weeks ago when the bishops in the United States thought it was important enough to suggest that people like Joe Biden, who in my estimation is as true to Catholic principles when it comes to poor people and immigrants and a whole list of things as any person on the planet, should be denied communion by the church when they still haven't cleaned up their house or anywhere close on the issues you've spent your life working on. What's your reaction?
Yeah, purportedly the most moral institution in the world, acting most immorally. Cardinal McCarrick used to hobnob with President Ford, with George W. Bush, with President Carter, with President Clinton. It's just, the Catholic Church does not have the moral authority to talk about morality the way they do when they're allowing the wholesale sexual abuse of children. As we're talking right now, children are being sexually abused. You haven't seen the children who were sexually abused by priests come out yet, who were abused in the late 90s or early 2000s, for instance. They're too young to come forward.
But wait a second, do you know that for a fact? Because I have to say, I have heard from people, and I'm sure you do too, who choose to draw comfort from the fact that so many of these charges, like in the McCarrick case right now, like what we saw in Canada, other places, are from decades ago, and they choose to live with the belief that it ended. How do you know that it did not?
Because they're starting to come forward now. The children who were abused in the early 90s and mid-90s are starting to contact me now, and I'm starting to settle those cases. The proof is in the pudding. They're coming forward. They're reporting having been sexually abused. It is not ending. What is changing is the public, because of the transparency, through the media, through advocates, through victims, the public is now aware that children must be watched when they're in presence in the custody of priests. The Catholic Church isn't changing. They've circled the wagons, but the change is coming from the outside.
Well, because of the courage of people like the clients you've represented through the years. And you, Mitchell, it's good to see you. As always, thanks for your time.
Good to see you. Thank you.